Okay, hi everyone. I'll just start introducing, even though I can see that people are starting to come in. So I'm Lucy Mablin. I work at the University of Sheffield. I'm senior lecturer in sociology. And I've been asked by Migrants Organise Solidarity Knows No Borders project to give one of the talks in this series. There is technical support in the chat, so I think that they will be giving instructions, but my understanding is that if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. So I've been asked to talk for about 40 minutes and then to take questions going up to the hour to 2 o'clock. So I think people still are drifting in, but I'll begin because we only have an hour. So. Right. So in this session, I'm going to explain what the hostile environment is, and I'm not going to assume that you necessarily know anything about it. I'm going to tell you what came before the hostile environment and what has come after. And I'm going to explain how we can understand the racial logics underpinning British immigration control by understanding British colonial histories and logics. And I've added at the end a bit about the illegal migration bill, because I think that's probably on a lot of people's minds at the moment. And as I said, I'm going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some Q&A. I think it's probably not as interactive as we would hope, but hopefully there will be an opportunity to ask questions and have a bit of a dialogue at the end. Right, so my slides are quite brief. It's just something to look at, so you're not looking at me giving a talk for 40 minutes. But if you're kind of not bothered about that, I think you can change the view to be just video view. So what is the hostile environment? In 2012, Theresa May announced in an interview with the Telegraph newspaper a set of policies which together have come to be called the hostile environment. And she famously said, the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. And the idea was to prevent people who don't have leave to remain in the UK. So in the US, they would often call those people undocumented. And in the UK, we tend to use the word irregular more. To prevent these people from being able to live an underground life, to make living irregularly in the UK almost impossible for those people. And the idea was that those people would then leave the UK if you made it very difficult and unpleasant to live here. And I don't know if you remember David Cameron's pledge to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. Well, the hostile environment became in many ways rhetorically connected to this agenda. And of course, irregular migrants aren't included in the net migration figures because they're not declaring themselves at ports, and the Home Office has always resisted publishing an estimate of the irregular migrant population, because when you know a number, then there's a kind of implication that you fail to control borders, or there's a problem that you have to do something about. But in spite of not knowing how many people this kind of new policy agenda would target, or knowing if they were causing any problems to anyone but themselves by staying below the radar, and this not affecting the net migration figure, there was an implication that the hostile environment would help support migration reduction efforts. And of course, people who are already living in the UK without appropriate visa would probably be avoiding the authorities already wherever possible. So they'd be unlikely to report crimes or try to access education or register with a GP. But the hostile environment really sought to make living below the radar, as I said before, for example, having particularly a place to live and a job, almost impossible. And these so-called illegal migrants can actually include a really broad range of different people. Visa overstayers are, of course, a really big group. So that would be people who maybe arrived on a tourist visa or a student visa or a spousal visa, perhaps a temporary work visa, and then stayed after that visa ran out, or maybe after the breakdown of relationship in the case of a spousal visa. Then it would include people who've made an application for asylum and that application has been rejected, but they, in fear of being returned to their home country, those people have perhaps absconded, and then also people who've been trafficked, who would have been brought into the country below the radar, and then would be continuing to live in that way, often in situations of labour exploitation. So, to create a hostile environment for these people, the government embedded immigration control into every aspect of life. The hostile environment policies included 2 acts of parliament, so in 2014 and 16, and a series of related policy interventions. So there was a legal duty introduced on landlords, the NHS, charities, banks, education institutions, the police, and many others to check immigration status, the immigration status of anyone they engage as, maybe a patient, a tenant, a student, a victim of crime. They increased the deportation of homeless people who were EU citizens and changed the rules around leave to remain based on the principle of deport first, appeal later. They encouraged voluntary deportation and reporting of others suspected to be irregular. So they did this through advertising campaigns, and you may remember the go home vans driving around areas where lots of migrants are known to live, with a helpline number emblazoned on them. And this policy agenda had a really significant impact on many people. So for individuals, the hostile environment was very successful in making people's lives very difficult. So people found that they couldn't rent accommodation anymore, that it was difficult to work, that they couldn't access healthcare or education, that if they were a victim of crime, they either wouldn't report it, but most likely if they did encounter the police as victims of crime, they were then reported to the Home Office. And the same for example, emergency healthcare. They found that they couldn't access bank accounts, that they had to perhaps remove their children from school to avoid being detected. They found that they were reported to the Home Office by social workers if a child welfare concern was raised, and they became more at risk of labour exploitation, including forced labour, coercive relationships, and harmful or exploitative relationships in order to access things like food and shelter. So we know these things because researchers looked at it, but because there are kind of no before and after statistics, we don't actually know if any changes have occurred in the number of irregular migrants residing in the UK, or if you've just created a population of people whose lives are very, very difficult. Now, the academic Neera Yuval-Davis and her colleagues at the University of East London have coined the phrase everyday borders to help them understand the impacts of this kind of policy where everyone becomes a border guard, and particularly the impacts beyond those immediately targeted. So we usually think of borders as being at the edge of territories, maybe in places like Dover or in airports. But this new type of policy approach places the border in the bank, the school, in the flat above the shop on the high street, and the landlord, the carpet shop manager, maybe the university lecturer, the social worker, take on the responsibilities now of border guards. And thinking of borders as part of everyday life, academics have started to ask, what does this do to people and communities and workplaces and to society as a whole? For communities, there are a range of impacts of the hostile environment. So people start to see others through the prism of the border. People are asked to surveil their neighbours. Diaspora communities or neighbourhoods with high numbers of people of migrant background feel under observation and surveillance by the state, but also by other people around them. And they find they need to prove quite often that they're legal. For society, Yuval-Davis and her colleagues have argued that this general environment of suspicion, of excluding people from free public services, suspecting people of criminality, just by existing without the right piece of paper, damages society as a whole. So it increases racism and hostility. And one important point is that the hostile environment doesn't just affect irregular migrants or even migrants in general. So for citizens or people with a status that allows them to be in the UK legally, they become responsible for border control in an absolutely unprecedented way. So people on the front line of public services like paramedics, nurses, social workers, teachers, even homeless shelters and police victim support officers, or people who help people who've experienced rape or sexual exploitation, who probably aren't interested in reporting someone to the Home Office and potentially subjecting them to violent and traumatic detention and deportation. These people become embroiled in this hostile immigration agenda. Social workers find that while they want to help vulnerable children, they might, in fact, make those children more vulnerable by reporting their parents to the Home Office. And all of these people that are doing this monitoring are citizens or those with an appropriate visa. But many citizens started to find themselves impacted and kind of seen as suspicious by this policy agenda. So Home Office evaluations have found that landlords were so worried about falling foul of the law that they rejected anyone who sounded or looked foreign to them and avoided renting accommodation to them. People found themselves reported to the Home Office by neighbours who didn't like them or people that they'd fallen out with. And while we're now all subject to these measures, so for example, we can't hire students to help at open days at the university without checking their passport, for example, and that's a hassle. While we're all subject to these kinds of measures, there's been a strong sense of racial profiling in relation to who finds themselves repeatedly suspected of illegality. So who's perceived to be a risky student or a risky tenant or victim of crime or employee. But this isn't just about racialized social perceptions, because of course, Britain until very recently was a multicultural empire where people had British passports, even though they were born in Jamaica or Pakistan. And what came to be known as the Windrush scandal was the hostile environment starting to capture people who arrived entirely legally, that sounded like I said illegally, entirely legally in Britain, who didn't need a visa at that time, and now many decades later found that they were being asked to prove their right to reside in Britain. And as these citizens, many of Afro-Caribbean and South Asian backgrounds, started to come into the purview of the hostile environment policies, the Home Office placed the burden of proof on individuals, and they had to show their residency in the UK before 1973. They had to prove it. So they were asked for at least one official document from every year that they'd lived in the UK, which of course was impossible for many people who keeps their payslips from 50 years ago. So hundreds of people have been detained and deported in the Windrush scandal, and thousands more have made claims to the government over it. In one highly publicised case, which is just kind of an example of what happens when you kind of come into contact with the border in this way, and then what can happen. A highly published case was Albert Thompson, who lived in London for 44 years, having arrived from Jamaica as a teenager. Mr. Thompson went to his first radiotherapy session for prostate cancer, only to be told that unless he could produce a British passport, he'd be charged £54,000 for the treatment. Okay, so I've told you what the hostile environment policy agenda is, and I've told you some of the impacts of it. And though I'm sure you can think of many more, and also probably from your own experiences in your lives and work, you can think of more. But the story of the hostile environment, I think, doesn't really start with Theresa May, actually. And I think we need to avoid the temptation to pin these things on just one person who is the baddie. And if we get rid of them, then it'll all be fine. I think we need to understand how the hostile environment policy agenda became thinkable. And to do that, we need to do two things. First, we need to go back to the early 2000s, when New Labour really started to go for it in terms of creating a hostile environment for people who are seeking asylum, particularly. And then we need to go back to British colonialism to understand how all of this harmful, disrespectful, dehumanizing stuff, which exists primarily to create a spectacle of punishment rather than properly to tackle a policy issue, how it all became thinkable. And all of this gets us to the question, I promise, of is the hostile environment racist? Answering that question. So back to the early 2000s. So the first thing to point out, especially if you are young or weren't concentrating on this stuff in the early 2000s, is that At that time, the Home Office was also beset by a state of perma-crisis, just as it is now. But in 2000, 2001, the issue was that there started to be an increase in the number of people who were applying for asylum in the UK, in part because of various wars and situations of displacement around the world, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in part because of the advent of faster, cheaper international air travel. Numbers peaked in 2002, around 84,000 applications were made that year. And this led to a massive moral panic in the tabloid media, very similar to the small boat channel crossings at the moment. Bogus asylum seekers became a key word of that period. And the panic was about these so-called bogus asylum seekers treating the UK as a soft touch to gain illegal entry. So people seeking asylum started to be reframed, not as asylum seekers, but as illegal immigrants who must be stopped from entering or removed if they had arrived. And in response to this, the new Labour government, led by Tony Blair, introduced more pieces of legislation on the topic of asylum than any in history. And in this period, there were 7 rafts of new legislation covering asylum. This succession of new laws removed all mainstream welfare benefit entitlement from asylum applicants and created a separate system to provide basic support and accommodation to them, including a no-choice national dispersal policy. Financial support was set below citizen welfare payments. Massive investment was made in the border area around Calais, including in relation to people sneaking into lorries. Carriers' liability was extended and immigration officers were given new powers to enter premises and search, arrest and detain asylum seekers. While the Race Relations Act in 2000 had extended anti-discrimination legislation into the public sector, people making immigration and asylum decisions were made exempt from that. They made it illegal for asylum seekers to travel without identity documents, as they're meant to be able to in the Refugee Convention. The appeal system was simplified, a white list of safe countries introduced to make some people automatically ineligible for asylum. Deportation to safe third countries was introduced, and resisting deportation made a criminal offence. They prohibited the provision of cash to asylum seekers whose first application for asylum was rejected, extended the grounds on which the government could exclude people from the Refugee Convention, removed the right to be granted indefinite leave to remain for people recognised as refugees under the Convention, and instead gave them a limited leave to remain for 5 years. The Home Office was given the power to withdraw support from families at the end of the asylum process, basically making them destitute as a means of encouraging their departure. Strict regulations were imposed on attending fingerprinting and reporting appointments, and asylum seekers whose first application had been refused were made exempt from eviction and housing laws designed to protect tenants. In 2007, they made it a requirement for asylum seekers to have biometric ID cards and imposed reporting conditions. This is just like people on police bail, on anyone with leave to remain to enter or remain in the UK. They extended powers of apprehension and detention and put the right to deport foreign criminals seeking asylum in law. Measures like detention have proliferated and now really a normal part of the asylum regime, and it's hard to remember a time when they weren't now. In 2002, at the beginning of all of this, Tony Blair announced that the numbers of asylum seekers entering the UK would be halved within a year. And the same year, the government ministers had called for policies to discipline countries not cooperating with measures aimed at the repatriation of refused asylum seekers. These disciplinary measures might include things like the withdrawal of trade privileges and development aid, with the armed forces being called upon to implement these and other asylum-related measures. For example, there was one proposal where the Royal Navy was to be used in intercepting asylum seekers headed to Europe by sea, and they might be partnered with the RAF, who would remove them in mass airlifts. In 2003, the New Vision Initiative made a case for processing all asylum applications outside of the UK in transit processing centres or regional protection areas, which would be located outside of Europe. And these kinds of proposals didn't make it into law, but I think they show the antecedents, the kind of ideas that were going around, and they have informed recent discussions around the illegal migration bill. So all of this that I've just kind of listed happened between 1999 and 2010. And we can see in this plethora of punitive legislation, which essentially made life horrific for those in the asylum system, we can see all the foundations for the hostile environment agenda. Since there was little more that could really be done within the limits of international refugee and human rights law to asylum seekers, Theresa May, in her period in the Home Office, turned her attention to illegal immigrants. It isn't immediately clear why she did this, so there wasn't a media moral panic on the scale of the early 2000s, putting the government under that kind of intense pressure. Theresa May was generally seen as quite a competent Home Secretary who didn't have such kind of permanent crisis as previous ones. But this was a period of very widespread panic in the tabloid and right-wing press about EU migrant workers. And aside from leaving the EU, there wasn't really a big lever that could be pulled that would solve that issue. So in a way, what she did was introduce the hostile environment as a mechanism to be seen to be tough on immigration, to distract from the fact that the government couldn't do much on EU migrants at that time. And actually for economic reasons, because EU migrants were significant net contributors to the economy, probably didn't want to. So all this brings us to the question of, is the hostile environment racist? And it can feel, I think, sometimes difficult to make this claim for people, because politicians tend to use very technocratic and race-neutral language as a defense of these policies. So the policies didn't target people with a particular skin color, they targeted administrative categories of people, and they weren't explicitly justified on the kinds of grounds that controls on Commonwealth immigration were in the 1960s. So then policy explicitly aimed to reduce what was referred to as coloured immigration. So these hostile environment policies target people with particular immigration statuses, and those people could in principle be white or black, Australian or Nigerian. The law doesn't care or discriminate. So when there's an accusation that the policies are racist, politicians quickly fall back, you may notice, on the technical language to get out of that kind of accusation. But at the same time as this sort of technocratic language is used as a defense when the racialized logic or impacts of these policies are called into question, racist language is also used as a justification when policies are outlined. So we have migrants being described as waves, invasions, and swarms, for example, and these words are often described by people as dog whistles because they send quite a clear message to particular audiences that racial, even racist logics are being used here without making them completely explicit. And we can also see how these policies seem both to explicitly target and accidentally incorporate racialized groups. But most importantly, I think, we see policy ideas becoming thinkable, which treat people as though they don't matter. So whole groups of people are treated as though human rights, dignity, and respect aren't really for them. They're forced to live in squalid housing, exposed to significant dangers and harms, willfully and by design. So they're treated as though they're not properly, fully, equally human. And we know that because of some of these measures, such as indefinite child detention, we know that this kind of thing just would be completely unthinkable if it targeted the children of Rishi Sunak or people like Theresa May or David Blunkett, who was Home Secretary in the early 2000s. So you can readily think of groups of people who these kinds of measures would be totally unthinkable in relation to. So in understanding that the hostile environment is racist, we need to understand racism not primarily or only in terms of unkind words and such like, but as something which inserts a set of logics about human worth into the structures of the state and into everyday encounters with the state. And I'm sure that you know that British colonialism was organised around the idea of racial hierarchy. So race as an organising principle was actually invented in order to legitimise and govern the European empires. And this is a key distinction between European colonialism and other colonialisms. So the idea that the world was inhabited by different people and that they were not only different, but hierarchically organised in races incorporated two aspects, as the sociologist Stuart Hall has told us. So both difference in terms of physical appearance and which bodies are more attractive or intelligent, and of cultural difference. So that's the idea that people have different cultures, some of which are more civilized than others and therefore better. And I'm sure you can see yourselves how messily the idea of the biological and the cultural have become entwined in racial thinking. So colonialism both invented these ideas and mainstreamed them around the world. But while these ideas, also then had very significant material effects on people's lives. For example, who was given land and became rich, who had their land stolen from them and ended up impoverished and subjugated. So this racial backdrop is fundamental in understanding how colonialism worked. So race was used to legitimate all kinds of terrible practices and events, and was integrated across political, economic, and social life in many places. And while decolonization movements in many cases successfully fought for their political liberation, ideas are much harder and more difficult to remove. So in this way, we can understand race as both invented, or sometimes academics call it socially constructed, so not an actual real thing that has any particular meaning beyond the social meaning humans have given to it, but also as something that has come to have really serious material implications for people's lives. And in the case of immigration to the UK, we need to think about it in the context of the British Empire and the racial ideas that organised it in understanding the material implications of that the migration regime had. So quite a lot of waves of what have been called immigration were actually people moving from colonies or later Commonwealth countries to the metropole. The Windrush generation arrived with British passports, so did Ugandan Asians, and there was actually no British passport which referred only to the islands of the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland until 1981. Before this, many people arriving here were simply exercising their right to move within the Empire or Commonwealth. But of course, there was this idea that the metropole and settler colonies were for white people, and the colonies proper, what became known as the third world or developing countries, was for Black and brown people. So in this post-war period, when many Black and brown citizens of empire started to move to the metropole, there began to be a panic, and this panic was racially based. So there were a succession of pieces of legislation which intended to stop or limit the movement of West Indians, South Asians, and Africans to Britain, at the same time as explicitly not curtailing the movement of white people from settler colonies like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And this came both from a sense of race as marking a physical difference and physical diversity as being distressing or threatening, and race marking a cultural difference as simultaneously inferior and threatening. So the idea for a long time, and perhaps still today, was that white mobilities are not a problem. They should be free to move, but the ability of Black and brown people is a problem which should be constrained. So the history of refugees is actually quite similar to this. So the Refugee Convention was signed by UN member states in 1951, but the colonial powers, who were also the major world powers at the time, of course, forcefully argued that colonized people shouldn't be included in human rights. And of course, this makes sense because in the colonial context, not everybody was understood to be equally human. For the Refugee Convention, which is one of several human rights conventions emerging in that post-war period, a geographical restriction was then inserted into it that meant that refugee rights were only for people displaced in Europe. And it was only with decolonization and really strong push from African states that these geographical restrictions on the right to asylum, apply for asylum in a foreign country, were lifted. So the story of panic and massive rafts of legislation in the 2000s didn't happen simply because there was an increase in asylum applications in the late 1990s and 2000s. It happened because Black and brown people started to apply for asylum in Britain in much larger numbers than previously. And after the Cold War, we'd entered this period in which refugees were rarely seen as racialized as white. So something similar happened to when citizens of empire started to move to the metropole in the 1950s and 60s. Efforts were made to close that movement down. And this is why the arrival of racialized people seeking asylum in the 90s and also the early 2000s led to this kind of outpouring of moral panic. If there are more of these people, it couldn't be the case that they were actual refugees. They've got to be economic migrants in disguise, cheating the system. And as I explained earlier, a whole host of measures were then introduced to make their lives, the lives of people waiting a decision, as unpleasant as possible. So I really think it's worth saying here that there's no evidence at all to suggest that at any point in the past 20 years, people applying for asylum in the UK have illegitimate claims or are cheating the system, including by the Home Office's own measures of recognition. The only distinction is that they're racialized as not white. And I've written in my academic work about the ways in which the kind of cruelty that's inflicted on people in the asylum system, the kind of impoverishment, the purposeful impoverishment and mental and physical harm, the marginalization, is indicative of the fact that people's lives are simply seen as less worthy and less worthless than others. Some people seem more easily degraded and abused, and I don't think we can understand that without recognizing the really long-standing ideas of racial hierarchy which have dominated British society for several centuries. So we've now had the Windrush lessons learned inquiry and a lot of hand-wringing about how it was that the wrong people got wrapped up in the hostile environment policy agenda. But the key point is that there isn't a clear-cut line between illegal immigrants and legal immigrants and citizens. So immigration and citizenship categories are complex and messy and multi-layered, and they also change significantly over time. So the same person can move through multiple categories in their life and can be unexpectedly put on the wrong side of the line because they didn't keep their payslips from 1972. And it isn't always easy to tell which category someone falls into. It's especially hard for these new proxy border guards. I am one of those as a university lecturer. And that includes also hospital receptionists and HR departments and landlords. It isn't always easy for us to disentangle the complexity and be confident in the decisions we're making. And as I mentioned previously, research has found that landlords and others tend to turn away particular people that they perceive to have foreign accents or to look like they may be foreign or to question them more commonly, just in case. But also, and just returning to the points I made about the colonial categories of racial difference, one key thing is that across the many categories, from citizen to illegal immigrant, we can see a consistent pattern that people who are read as non-white, whether through their name, their skin color, their accent, or their country of origin or birth, they are the consistent targets of surveillance, of hassle, and relentless efforts to make them go away. And in this sense, it can be more helpful, I think, to think about challenging these kinds of ideas in terms of anti-racism rather than in terms of the labels and categories created by the bureaucracy and trying to identify and defend people on that basis. So just before the end, I wanted to talk a little bit about the new illegal migration bill, because I'm sure it's on your minds, as it is on mine. So all of this that's happened over the past 20 to 30 years alongside this long trajectory of the hostile environment, and I mentioned it very briefly earlier, but also has been this hardening of the UK border in northern France. So it began when the Channel Tunnel opened in 1994. And from that point on, there has been a constant increase in the fortifications and measures to harden the French-UK border. And because of the way that forced and refugee migration works, when you increase border controls, the movement of people tends not to stop, but to shift to alternative routes. So at the Channel border zone, we've seen people at first seeking to cross through the Channel tunnel, and then shifting to stowing away in lorries. And when that became impossible, starting to make more dangerous journeys in small boats. So in a way, the policy interventions which have sought to close the Channel to irregular migration have actually funneled people into the small boats. They've created the business model for smugglers and made small boats the primary method of entry to the UK for people who are in northern France and who want to seek asylum in the UK. The illegal migration bill is meant to stop this. So it's meant to stop these journeys through deeming everybody who arrives by the Channel or any other means of their own volition inadmissible for asylum. So it actually ends asylum in the UK for anybody who makes their own way here, which is the vast majority of people. And instead of entering the asylum system, people will be detained in army barracks and detention centres and disused ferries and construction barges for 28 days. And then they will either be deported to Rwanda, who said they can take 200 people, or to their home country. And those who can't be deported to their home country, so that would include Afghans, Syrians, Eritreans, or Iranians, and that's the vast bulk of people who are crossing the Channel at the moment, they'll reside as illegal immigrants in the UK with no rights, and it's not clear what will happen to these people. So there's no evidence from similar policies around the world that these deterrence effects work, and I've reviewed all of the research literature from different cases, particularly Australia, but also Israel had a similar deal with Rwanda. And so I'm not convinced that this deterrent effect is real, but we'll have to see what happens. And my prediction really is looking at the evidence globally that this policy won't stop the boats, but instead will create a large and growing population of precarious illegal immigrants who are extremely vulnerable to exploitation. So this new illegal immigration bill follows these colonial racist logics, and it follows them through even further than we've seen before. I think it's fair to say, an extreme far-right authoritarian policy agenda, which makes real the previously unthinkable. But at the same time, what I want you to understand from this session is that Priti Patel and Suella Braverman aren't new people who are changing everything. They're standing on the shoulders of those who've come before. So since 2001, every Home Secretary has taken the same logics a step further on the path to where we are today. And that path is formed by colonial logics of human worth, in my view. So the short answer is that yes, the hostile environment is racist. And that's the end of what I wanted to say. So I'm going to go over to you guys and maybe we can have some questions. But I saw that Stuart Crosthwaite had made the point that we can see in the differential treatment of people from Ukraine and Hong Kong. And that's certainly the case. So I think around 50,000 people crossed the Channel last year, and 150,000 Ukrainians were able to arrive through safe routes. And I think it's the same number of people from Hong Kong. I don't know whether we would call those refugees or because it's a kind of colonial legacy relationship visa scheme. But anyway, yes, we can certainly see very much larger numbers of people arriving through those schemes are not seen as a problem or given much media attention. So I've just seen that Martin has commented about the word, about the use of language, and that's something really important that we need to kind of be really aware of. So as hopefully I conveyed in my talk, all of these categories, some are legal categories. So asylum seeker is an administrative category. It's really someone who's made an asylum application. Illegal immigrant is more of a politicized category, and a lot of effort has been gone to try and cast people who want to make an application for asylum as illegal immigrants. up until this point, that's been a kind of rhetorical strategy, but the new illegal migration bill makes that a new legal category. So there won't be asylum applicants in the same way, because they will all be categorized as illegal immigrants and subject to detention. So yeah, that's a very important point. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the intersection of colonial policing and its technologies, and the colonialism of hostile environments. So I'll go with that bit of that question from Caris first. Yes, so some people talk about this in terms of the colonial boomerang. So the kinds of policies and strategies, many policies and strategies, and especially around policing and punishment, were experimented with in colonies, and then later the boomerang used back in the metropole, and particularly to target undesirable populations in this kind of hierarchical schema of the empire. And so I think there are really significant intersections, and there are several like brilliant people working on this issue at the moment who maybe, Caris, I could share some of their names and work with later. Okay, so I think Caris had one more question. Do you have any thoughts on why it is that New Labour's role in sowing the seeds of the hostile environment seems to so often be overlooked in mainstream discussions on the issue? What's the advantage of highlighting it? So why is it downplayed? I think there's definitely something similar happens on the economic side, where I don't know if we call New Labour on the left, but where the left are seen as not readily authoritarian enough or wanting to be harsh on migrants. So when they are, that's acknowledged less, and they're seen as more incompetent, and the right is seen as more naturally operating in that space. So I think that's partly why it tends not to be talked about, but it's very interesting because Labour were so terrible on asylum and have such a bad track record. So while I want in the next election, would be hopeful that the Tories would not win, I wouldn't expect Labour to do anything better. I think any legislation we get through on the illegal migration bill, etc., I think it's going to be difficult to get Labour to roll that back, because they almost want to be as bad, kind of as harsh as possible, to try and prove that they can kind of flex their muscles on that side. And I think that in activist spaces and things that you talk about, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the left is not automatically anti-racist or pro-migrant, and doing some work trying to intervene in the Labour Party position on these issues at the moment, but it's very difficult because it's seen as literally incredibly risky for them. Okay, so Emma asks, is the hostile environment unique to the UK? So there's three parts. Is it unique to the UK? Is there such hostility in other colonizing countries? And is there evidence of hostility in previously colonized countries? So no, the policy isn't unique, but I think that, so the agenda specifically developed in the run-up to the hostile environment was around asylum, is a global phenomenon which has been echoed in many places across Europe, North America, Australia. And we can see then many aspects of the effort to crack down on illegal migrants, specifically through the hostile environment, echoed in other places. So several states have made it illegal to help, in the US have made it illegal to help people who are undocumented, for example, so it's illegal to give them a lift in your car. Many people have been arrested across France and Italy for saving someone's life in the sea, or giving them medical treatment, or driving them to a medical facility, giving them shelter for the night. The mayor of Calais, for a period, made it illegal to give food to help migrants. So kind of various different laws and strategies where which have brought citizens into the space of kind of operating as border guards, or being at risk of breaking the law by helping people, have been used around the world, definitely, and yes, across places that were colonizing countries. And there's a lot of policy sharing across countries in that way. And so in relation to, is there evidence of hostility in previously colonized countries? Yeah, there's loads of evidence of hostility to different groups of migrants in countries that were previously colonized. And it's definitely the case that kind of ideas of racial, ethnic, cultural difference, and as societies having a specific territorial space that must be protected through kind of border controls, has like been promoted through colonialism, but also there's a lot of, I mean, it's like such a big topic, but there's a lot of efforts of, for example, the European Union down into Africa, and say the US and North America down into Latin America, of using their influence, but also development aid and investment to encourage developing like biometric databases and border controls and these sorts of things to stop people from moving. So it's much more complex than just those countries developing them kind of endogenously. Okay, so Geraldine, so she's asking about how to respond to specific events. She says public opinion is very persuaded by the one bag apple narrative, and how can we understand and present the specific examples of non-white unwelcome migrants, ranging from aggression to things like pity or condescending tones, as part of this historical system that I talked about. The full picture is so complex that believing that racist events are isolated is much easier for the general public, including those who feel inclined to welcome migrants. I think that's a fantastic question, Geraldine. And I think academics are definitely not the best people to ask about how to turn a massive complex issue into like a really good soundbite. I know that when I've done things with the media, I shy away from going into that kind of historical complexity, and I tend to focus on all of the evidence that we have from other countries and how borders work, and kind of myth busting on those things, because I feel like there isn't a lot of time to really, usually in a few seconds or a few minutes when you're being interviewed on the news or on the radio or something, the time scales are so short. So I try and do as many things as I can like this that are more long form and able to kind of go a little bit more into it. But yeah, I think there are going to be people who are so much better qualified than me to answer the question of how do you do like PR or campaigns in a kind of pithy, accessible way. Yeah, and academics are notoriously terrible at that. Naomi says, what are my top policy changes that I'd make if I were Home Secretary? So the small boat channel crossings problem is manufactured by border controls. And so in many ways, the UK government keeps manufacturing a crisis to be seen to solve the crisis by doing interventions only that will not stop it or will perpetuate it. So I think for me, one of the big things that I'm working on with my some colleagues, that we have a research project about government responses to channel crossings. A big thing for me would be to start from what we know about how these journeys work and what's actually going on, and to really put centering stopping the boats and human dignity and human rights at the centre of any solutions to this particular issue. So apart from kind of abolishing much of the kind of asylum policy that we've had over recent years, I think in this most immediate situation, we're really thinking about what are sustainable responses rather than solutions. And we're thinking about ways of thinking about policy interventions which are putting human dignity at the centre of it. So we're thinking a lot about defunding the border. So huge amounts of money goes into border control in northern France. And what could that money, in a similar way to defund the police, what could that money go into that would allow people to, for example, access legal advice, accommodation, food, support, translation, family reunification schemes that would actually start to tackle some of the things that are happening. So yeah, in this moment, aside from all of the things like the UK has stopped making asylum decisions, so starting to make asylum decisions so people can get on with their life, and ending the detention estate. For the small boat channel crossings, it's really about looking at what the evidence shows us about why people are there and making interventions that actually are going to be a sustainable response rather than perpetuating the crisis. Okay, would I say that British social work needs a reckoning with its colonial history, and for this history to be part of the curriculum? Do you know what? I don't know, I'm like sociologist, and I don't know loads and loads about the history of the entanglement of social work and colonialism, although I can guess at some of it from other things I know about the state and colonialism and migration. I think that it's really important that we know the history of our country. So I didn't learn anything about colonialism at school in the UK, and I learned about it in my degree, and I learned about it myself when I was doing my PhD. So I think that in many disciplines and areas of kind of training, that's starting to shift. And I think learning about the history of a country is very important in understanding how we came to be where we are now. And I know that I have colleagues who train social workers here at Sheffield who are incorporating even just teaching on race and racism, like what are ideas of race, where do they come from, how do they come into social work practice, how do things around immigration and borders come into social work practice, how do we engage with people, how do we think about different people that we're working with. And I think, and I've got the impression from them that this is like an unusual thing to be including in the curriculum, which has really surprised me. So I don't know if I go as far as a reckoning, but I think that the training curriculum should reflect learning about the history of the country that you're working in and how that has shaped how social work is and how it works now, and some of the many challenges facing social workers now in relation to the immigration regime and questions of racism in practice as well. Okay, I've got 4 minutes left and just 2 questions, so I did quite well. Would I like to, so Mervyn says, would I like to comment on the role of the press in the hostile environment? So as a really strong relationship between politics and the right-wing press, particularly in the UK, and going back to one of the examples before about Ukrainians and Hong Kongers who've arrived in absolutely gigantic, enormous numbers compared to small boat channel crossers, I feel like I've heard so little, even though I'm a person that's concentrating on these things, I heard so little about this, especially people from Hong Kong. in the press, so little discussion of how people are getting on, or what's happening, or how many people there are. And then the role of the press in obviously fueling this small boats crisis narrative, and the kind of all of that. And that was definitely a big feature in the early 2000s as well. So I think that the press are part of the discourse that shapes the moral panic. And I think in some governments, I don't think this is the case in the new Labour government, but certainly since 2010, the Home Office has only really interacted with the Telegraph and right-wing think tanks who have people working who also are writing for the Telegraph and other right-wing newspapers. And I think that makes it very difficult to start to shift the discourse. I think it like strongly shapes. So I know in lots of media that I've done, you don't even get to explain how anything is. You just spend the whole time explaining why everything they've just said is wrong. And it's always on those terms of the kind of right-wing press agenda, which is very challenging. Okay, one more question. So Hira says, do you have any references for academics working on the impact of border landscapes on enforcing border controls? So yeah, natural environments like seas, mountains, deserts as well, are often used as a way of a kind of supplementary way of controlling borders by governments. There is a literature here, especially the biggest literature that I've seen is on the Sonoran Desert in the US, between the US and Mexico. If you email me, I can send you a list of references, because I do have a load in my teaching references on those kinds of topics. So probably rather than me listing lots of people now, which might be boring for other people, maybe get in touch with me later about that. I've seen that one more person asked if there's anything that makes me feel hopeful in terms of political organising or something else. I think loads of amazing, as Ali, the tech support, has said, there's lots of organising going on, and that's really heartening and positive. But certainly struggling to feel it's good to be organising always and resisting, but I don't think that I could say that I'm feeling hopeful at the moment, unfortunately. And I think that brings us to 2 o'clock, in fact. So I don't know how many people we have left, but thank you so much for everybody who attended. And I think that the recording will be released later if you want to share it with any colleagues. And yeah, thanks for taking an hour out of your day.